of it all, and you are worthy of it all.
So let's go ahead and get started. So last week we talked initially about what we're going to cover. And our apologetics topics here, remember this is a live stream that I'm doing for Victory Outreach Church at Tacoma, which is my home church here in the Puget Sound region. And we are going to be talking about an 8-part series on apologetics. And specifically we're going to be covering God and the life, death, deity, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so let's get started on talking about that, because today is actually the first day that we're going to be talking about specifically about our arguments for God's existence. So before we start too far into it, I do want to say that we do have to talk a little bit about proof and what it means to have proof. Now, understand that there's almost nothing in the universe that someone can say that they can prove 100% without a shadow of a doubt. 100% proof is what is in philosophical terms called Cartesian certainty. Now, the only thing that can give you Cartesian certainty really is like mathematics. Okay, so 1 + 1 is 2. That is a Cartesian certainty. It can be proved essentially without any evidence otherwise. But minus that, almost nothing can be given 100% proof. So when an atheist says to you, well, show me evidence or give me proof that God exists, the first thing you should say to him is, well, what do you mean by proof? Because the reality is we live our lives as if we have proof for a lot of things that in fact we don't technically have proof for. But most of the time when honest people are talking about proof, what they're actually talking about is whether the amount of evidence for something is greater than the amount of evidence against that thing. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about proof typically. Now, here's an example of that. When we talk about proof, you ate breakfast yesterday, probably. But the truth of the matter is there's almost no way that you can actually prove that to me, okay? You have memories of your childhood, but there's virtually no way of proving it, okay? So there are many things in our lives that we don't have true Cartesian certainty type proof for, but yet we still act like it. In fact, the truth of the matter is we can't even really prove that we aren't in the Matrix. Although we have good reason to believe that. Now, let's also talk just a little bit about what we are talking about or saying when we say an argument. This is not an argument like you see here on this screen. Instead, we're talking about philosophical arguments. Now, philosophical arguments, there are many different types of philosophical arguments. But we're here only going to be talking about 2 types. The first is deductive arguments. Now, we have learned this throughout school, if not formally, in all kinds of different ways. Deductive arguments are ones where it starts with at least 2 premises, and then if those 2 premises are true, or proven to be true, or shown to be true, then the conclusion of the argument is necessarily true. Okay? Here is, in philosophical terms, how deductive arguments work. All A has quality B. Item C is an A. Therefore, C has quality B. Let me give you a real life example. All humans are animals. Jim is a human. Therefore, Jim is an animal. Now, we are going to be talking about the Kalam Cosmological Argument in a moment. It is a type of deductive argument. So remember, if the 2 premises are true, then the conclusion is absolutely true. So what you have to attack, if you want to attack a deductive argument, is one of the premises, not the conclusion. Okay? The other type of argument is called an inductive argument. Now, this is the type of argument or the type of reasoning we use every single day. And basically, although this is the technical definition you see here displayed on the screen, the reality is an inductive argument is the inference to the best explanation. So if you have two different explanations for the same thing, then if explanation A provides a 51% of the evidence, and argument B gives you 49%, then you go with argument A. And a type of example of this is the minimal facts approach to the resurrection of Jesus that Gary Habermas and Michael Licona proposed in their book, Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus. We'll be talking about that in a few weeks, but many of the pieces of evidence that we are going to show today for the cosmological argument for God's existence fall into the realm of an inductive argument. In other words, it's an argument to the best explanation, not a 100% proof. Okay? Now, let's think back to our last episode where we talked about the fact that all beliefs begin with a claim. And our claim here that we're going to be attacking this week and for the next 2 weeks is that God exists. We saw in Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. In Exodus 20, God said to Moses in the burning bush, tell the Israelites, I am. The many passages in the Old Testament talk about how God has been from everlasting to everlasting. And then the New Testament it really delineates how God is a triune God, three persons in one God. So that's the claim. Now we have to start talking about reasons. And the reasons we're going to give three: the cosmological argument, okay? And then we're going to go with the teleological argument and then the moral argument. Today we will start with the cosmological argument. And those are called arguments for the existence of God or theistic arguments. Now, our first theistic argument is the cosmological argument. And some people may wonder, what does that mean? Well, this little video will give you an example of that. When we are talking about the cosmological argument, cosmos means universe. So the cosmological argument is the argument from the universe, or from the existence of the universe, or from the beginning of the universe. And in fact, the two arguments that we'll be attacking today are from the beginning of the universe, and you'll see how that comes into play. Now, any Christian knows that the Bible starts off Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now, in Genesis 1, it discusses the creation of the universe as being a 7-day event. On the seventh day, God rested, so really in 6 days. And there are many Christians out there who hold very tightly to the concept that it was 6 24-hour days. I am not going to get into the arguments about whether it was or was not 24 hours. What I am going to say is that the quote-unquote Big Bang of science and in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth are not contradictory. In fact, the Big Bang and the evidence for the beginning of the universe is some of the most well-shown scientific evidence for the existence of God. In fact, there are actually many scientists, including Jastrow, who is one of the world's leading astrophysicists, who says of the evidence that it's like looking into the eyes of God when you look into some of the evidence for the creation of the universe. So I would argue to you that it's very important for a Christian, not when they are talking to an atheist, not to try to argue for a 6-day creation or a new earth. Rather, because honestly what's going to happen there is that an atheist is going to just shut off, because they're going to say you're unintellectual and I'm not going to talk to you anymore about this. Rather, I would talk to them about the evidence for the beginning of a universe, because that has scientific data to back it up, so that you're talking on the same plane in the same manner. Now, the first question we really need to ask when we are talking about the beginning of the universe or the universe in general is a question that dates back to the 13th century to St. Thomas Aquinas, and it was also asked by the famous Gottfried Leibniz, who is the founder of calculus. And that question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Because obviously, theoretically, there could be nothing rather than the something that we actually see. So, Aquinas, built on the question of why is there something rather than nothing, came up with what is known as an atemporal argument. In other words, an argument that does not involve time at all. Okay, it does not involve time. He started by saying that there is such a thing as a contingent being. And what he means by a contingent being is that although it exists, it might not have existed. Okay, we'll use a pair of shoes. Okay, not only could that pair of shoes, your pair of shoes, not existed, it could have existed, theoretically at least, in some other form. It depends on something else, in this case, a shoemaker, for its existence. So that's what a contingent being is. Now, he then put forth the principle of causation, or what he also called sufficient reason. And that is, he said every contingent being or event has a reason or explanation for why it exists rather than why it does not exist. And that just seems intuitively obvious. Again, why does your pair of shoes exist? Well, because some company or some cobbler decided to make that pair of shoes. And here is how his argument plays out. Now, it seems very complicated, but we're going to go through this argument step by step by step. A couple of them actually can kind of be grouped together, and it makes the argument easier to understand and to argue for. The first is a contingent being exists. This is absolutely intuitive. It's obvious. Humans exist. Matter exists. The universe exists. I don't think anyone out there, minus someone who may be a little out there in their thinking and thinks we actually do live in the Matrix, I don't think anybody out there really believes that no contingent beings exist. No matter exists. So that one's obvious, and it's kind of a gimme. Now 2 and 3 go together, and the 2 and 3 state this being has a cause for its existence, and this cause is something other than the contingent being itself. In other words, what he's saying by number 2 and number 3 is that nothing can cause itself to exist. Again, this seems obvious. If the shoes already existed, they can't create themselves. And if they're not in existence yet, they're nothing, and therefore nothing can create something. Okay? Now, let's move away from shoes and we'll use this ball. And you'll see why here in just a moment. If I'm walking through the woods and I see a 1 foot large diameter ball sitting in the woods, that ball did not create itself, and it did not put itself there. It's a contingent being. Something else made it, something else put it there. And it doesn't matter whether that ball is 1 foot in diameter, or 3 feet in diameter, or as big as a continent, or as big as a solar system, or even as big as the universe. In other words, because the universe is a contingent being, it has a cause that's not the universe. Okay? Now, this goes along with science. You have to understand, science is based on the assumption that the natural world behaves in a consistent and predictable manner. What do I mean by that in this particular aspect of the argument? Well, we don't just see things popping into existence uncaused out of nothing. We also don't see things causing their own existence. That is what science is based on. Now, premise number 4 in his argument is this cause must be another contingent being, or what he termed a necessary or non-contingent being. Again, this seems obvious. Either the cause of a contingent being is another contingent being, humans created the ball, humans created the shoe, or some non-contingent being created the object itself, the ball or the shoe. Again, this seems just absolutely obvious. His next statement was, contingent beings alone cannot explain the existence of all contingent beings. Now, this may be a little difficult to understand at first, but if you stop and think about it, if you continue to go back in time, no matter where you start, and you go back and back and back and back and back and back, ultimately you will reach some contingent being that nothing existed beforehand. Okay? In other words, it leads to an infinite regression. Infinite regressions, I will show you in just a moment, are not possible at all. Here's how I'm going to prove that to you. Let's take the cosmos out of it for a moment and talk about my library. And we're going to say that my library is an actual infinite number of black and red books. An actual infinite number of black and red books. Now, if I were to subtract out all of the red books, understand that if I took all the red books out of an infinite number of red and black books, I would be taking out an infinite number of books. Now, that is problematic mathematically. Why is that problematic mathematically? Because if I subtract that infinite number of red books from the infinite number of red and black books, I'm still left with an infinite number of black books. Why is that nonsensical? Well, because I've just subtracted an infinite from an infinite and gotten an infinite. I'll give you a slightly different example. If I went back to my slide where I had all red and black books, an infinite number, and I said after the third book, take all of them out. Now I would be subtracting an infinite from an infinite and getting the number 3. Mathematically, it's impossible to subtract the same number from something and get 2 different answers. So an actual infinite is impossible. And if you can't read the birds here, the student bird says, what are other words for nonsensical? And the professor says, preposterous, absurd, ridiculous, ludicrous, foolish, silly, senseless, stupid, idiotic, and meaningless. And that's true in this case. So number 6 is then, therefore at least one thing must have had a non-contingent or necessary being as a cause. In this case, it's the universe. The universe itself had to have had a necessary being as a cause. And what do we call a necessary being? We call necessary beings God. And there is only one. Now, let's move on. I know that one was difficult. We're going to move on now, and we're going to talk a little bit about some objections to that. The first is from famous skeptic and atheist Richard Swinburne. And he said, he asked the question, why do we need an explanation of every contingent being? And he specifically tried to use a hanging lamp like you see pictured here. And he said, why do we have to posit any explanation for the lamp hanging there other than the chain links holding it in place? Well, I'm sorry, but that's just an arbitrary stop at where we're trying to get an explanation. Obviously, to most people, they would ask not just why is the chain link there, but why is the ceiling there? Why is the house there? Why did someone decide to put the light there? So Swinburne's argument, at least to me and to most people, seems arbitrary and capricious, and it doesn't really get to the heart of what Aquinas was trying to get to, which is why is there something rather than nothing. Now, the other argument, so that again, there we go. The other argument is from Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell takes a different tactic on this. He too is an atheist and a skeptic, and he says, we cannot ask about the cause of the universe. It's just there, and that's all. Well, I'm sorry. Again, to me, that's just an absolutely arbitrary stopping point. Why does Russell stop at the universe to say, well, it's just there, that's all? Why doesn't he stop at planets or humans or apes? It's an arbitrary stopping point, and to me is just not intellectually satisfying at all. So I would say, in terms of Russell's argument, it's just garbage, and any philosophy professor, in my mind, if it weren't Bertrand Russell signing the paper, would probably give him an F on his philosophical paper if he wrote, it's just there and that's all. That's an atheism of the gaps argument. In other words, I don't have an explanation, so why do I need one? It's just trying to fill in the gaps with a I don't know. Let's move on now to the much simpler and more common one used today. Now, the Kalam Cosmological Argument, believe it or not, was actually started by an Islamic scholar in the 13th and 14th century. And he did it as a discussion point back to several other philosophers at the time who were trying to kind of get rid of some of the beginning of the universe. And so he said that if you start doing that, then you're throwing out all of monotheism and the concept that God created the universe. So he came up with this very elegant argument. Here's the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. And number three, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, let's tackle each one of those independently. The first one, whatever began to exist has a cause. Again, this is simply an intuitive statement. As we talked about before, science is based on the assumption that the natural world behaves in a consistent and predictable manner. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Otherwise, if we just walked around seeing things pop into existence out of nothingness on a regular basis, scientists wouldn't be able to study the natural world. For instance, if you're walking down the street and you see an iPhone, no one in their right mind would think that iPhone just popped into existence on that sidewalk in front of me. Rather, the presence of that iPhone indicates a creator of the iPhone. In a similar manner, buildings indicate the presence of not only a builder, but an architect. Creation indicates a creator. And that's what we're saying. Again, that's an intuitive thing. So let's move on to the second argument, or the second premise in the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and that is that the universe began to exist. Now, here is where we go back to what we were talking about before with our belief and our claim and our reasons. Our belief and our claim here is the universe came into existence. So now we need to provide evidence for that, and here's the evidence that we're going to talk about. We've already talked about the fact that going backwards in time in an infinity, in an actual infinite number of days, is a philosophical impossibility. Actual infinites don't exist. An actual past infinite number of days doesn't exist. And we've already talked about that philosophically. So that just doesn't hold. Trying to start from today and walking back in history to the beginning of the universe, if it were infinite, would be like this video, where the little girl is walking at the exact same speed as the moving sidewalk, and therefore she will never reach her destination of Mama's Starbucks coffee on the other side of the glass. Okay? This, again, just seems intrinsically obvious and mathematically is an impossibility. Now let's look at the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. Now, probably everybody watching knows who this little guy is. It's R2-D2 from the Star Wars series, but we're not going to talk about R2-D2. We're going to talk about our acronym R2-B2. R2-B2 is the acronym I've come up with to help us remember the evidence for the beginning of the universe. Notice I'm not saying the Big Bang, I'm saying the beginning of the universe. The first R in R2-B2 is relativity. That's Einstein's theory of general relativity. The second one is the red shift, R for red shift, R2. The B is background, for cosmic background radiation. In other words, the heat and electromagnetic radiation coming out of the original origin of the universe. And then number 4, which is the 2, second law of thermodynamics. So let's start with Einstein. Einstein is the first R. Einstein in 1917 came up with his theory of general relativity. We all learned it in school as E equals mc squared. Now obviously it was a whole heck of a lot more complex than that. Einstein, however, didn't like the fact that his calculations actually indicated that the universe was expanding. He didn't like that fact. At that time, the current concept was that the universe was held to be eternal in its past origin. It turns out Einstein had made a mistake initially and had tried to divide one of his numbers by 0. And 2 years later, a different scientist pointed this out, and when that was corrected, Einstein's theory of general relativity came into its current form, and it predicts, without a doubt, an expanding universe. And subsequent experiments have shown that Einstein's calculations are accurate to many, many decimal places. So we start with Einstein's theory of general relativity. Now we move on to the red shift. What is the red shift, and who is this guy? Well, the red shift is something that was discovered by Edwin Hubble in the 1940s. Edwin Hubble, whose name is given to the Hubble space telescope, discovered a red shift. He was looking through the telescope that you see there at different stars and galaxies, and what he noticed was that the lights he saw were more red on the spectrum than what he would have anticipated for stars giving off white light. Let's go back to 6th grade science class for a moment. Remember, white light, like out of a light bulb or from the sun, if you catch it just right in a prism, it breaks into the different colors of the rainbow. In fact, that's why we get rainbows. And those colors are Roy G. Biv: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Well, when a white light is moving away from you, if you measure the wavelength of that light, it's going to be more red on the spectrum than the white light would be if it's sitting still. If it's moving towards you, it would be blue, more blue on the spectrum. And what Hubble discovered was that every star and galaxy that he examined had a red shift compared to what he anticipated it would show. What does that mean? It means that he showed without a shadow of a doubt that the universe is expanding. Now, not only is it expanding, but what he found is that the stars and galaxies farther away from Earth are actually more redshifted, indicating they're moving away faster than the stars closer to us. What does that mean for us? And what does that mean for science? What it means is that as the universe expands, it's actually expanding faster. Okay? So, Hubble's discovery of the red shift is infinitely important in terms of showing the proof behind the universe coming into existence. Now, in 1965, while working at Bell Laboratories, these two guys, Penzias and Wilson, were taking measurements of the cosmos. They were cosmologists. And they started picking up some readings from their equipment that you see pictured behind them there. They were so confused by it that at one point they actually thought that it was bird droppings from pigeons, and they went out and cleaned the entire outside of their recording instruments. And lo and behold, when they came back, they still got the same measurements. What are those measurements? Well, those measurements are what have since been shown to be what is called cosmic background radiation. What that is this. Anytime you have an explosion or a bang, it lets off multiple different types of radiation: heat, sound, light, electromagnetic radiation. And so what they were actually picking up is the electromagnetic radiation that is still persistent in the universe from the initial bang, if you will. Okay? It's too long in the past for us still to have visible light waves from it, but they could pick up electromagnetic light waves or waves from it. Now, not only did Penzias and Wilson win the Nobel Prize for this, but in the 1980s, again in the 2000s, and again in the 2010s, NASA showed that Penzias and Wilson's documentation of the cosmic background radiation is not only true, but further, all those little dots you now see here on the screen in the COBE, the WMAP, and the Planck NASA experiments actually show not only the underlying background cosmic radiation, but also what's called the ripple effect. The ripple effect is that same type of energy coming from the formation of individual stars and individual galaxies. So now we have the cosmic background radiation not only of the universe, but of galaxies and stars themselves. Again, repeated 3 separate times by NASA. Let's move on now to the second law of thermodynamics. That's our 2 at the end of R2B2. Now, put in its technical way, the second law of thermodynamics reads, energy transformations lead to an increase in entropy in a system. What is entropy? Disorder. So in other words, while the universe seems to be becoming more and more ordered with the formation of galaxies, stars, planets, and solar systems, entropy would act, which is a law of physics, and some would say the most important law of physics, actually says it should be going in the other way. It should be going from order to disorder. In other words, entropy always increases. Another way of putting it is that in a closed system, heat is always going to dissipate from a hotter substance to a colder substance. We see this every day when we take out a glass, we put an ice cube in it, and we pour our Coca-Cola over it that's warmer. What happens? Well, while we all think of the ice as cooling the liquid, the Coca-Cola, in reality, what is happening is the Coca-Cola is heating up the ice. And because of that, at some point in time in every closed system, it reaches an equilibrium. What does that mean for us? In our system, if there isn't something still charging and putting energy into the system, it would be lights out. Why is that important? Well, remember our discussion about how the universe is not infinitely old? If the universe was infinitely old, all the galaxies and stars would have burned out. Think of it like lighting a candle before you go to bed, and by the time you wake up in the morning, the candle has burned through all of the energy. Or you went on a camping trip and you turned a flashlight on. ultimately the batteries in that are going to run out. The same is true of stars. The sun is a star. Every day we wake up and the sun is shining. That in and of itself is proof that the universe is not infinitely old. In fact, this guy, Vilenkin, who is one of the world's top astrophysicists, said at the great skeptic and brilliant scientist Stephen Hawking's birthday party, all evidence we have says the universe had a beginning. He, by the way, is not a Christian. He is an agnostic. Okay? So that tells you how much this evidence points toward the creation, the beginning of all of the universe. So now we've gone through whatever begins to exist has a cause. That seems intuitive to us all. The second, the universe began to exist, and we gave all of the evidence behind that, R2B2. The third is the conclusion. And because the first two premises are the evidence far, far, far outweighs any evidence against it, the universe therefore has a cause. Now, the obvious question, and the first question you'll oftentimes get from an atheist or an agnostic is, well, that's all good and well. The universe has a cause, but who says that cause is God? So, do you get the God of Christianity from the Kalam Cosmological Argument? No, not quite. However, you've got to understand that in classical apologetics, first you get to truth, then you get to the existence of God, then you go to Christianity. So the evidence for Christianity lies much more in things like prophecy and the life, death, deity, and resurrection of Jesus Christ than it does in things like the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Understand, though, this argument is something you're going to be using when talking to atheists or agnostics simply to get them to God exists. Remember, that's what we're going over right now. God exists. Okay? So, let's talk, though, about what kind of being does the Kalam Cosmological Argument get you to. We've already said the universe has a cause, and that's a necessary cause. It can't be a contingent one. Well, that cause needs to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, and personal. Why is that? Well, it has to be timeless because remember, before the universe came into existence, nothing existed. No time, no space, no matter. All time, space, and matter came into existence with the beginning of the universe, with the creation. So whatever caused the creation has to be timeless. Note I didn't say infinite, timeless, because God transcends time. The second is that creation or that cause of the universe has to be spaceless. All time, space, and matter came into existence with creation. Think of it like a balloon that right now is blown up, but initially was small, so small that it was a pinpoint, and before that, nothing. No space even existed before the creation. That being also has to be immaterial. Again, all matter came into existence at the time of the creation. So we now have a timeless, spaceless, immaterial being that created the universe. And obviously, in order to create the universe and all the energy that is within the universe that feeds all galaxies, stars, and dark matter, and everything else that has energy in it, that being had to have immense power to be able to bring all matter and energy into existence. Furthermore, that being had to be personal. Why personal? Well, it goes back to the point that Aquinas and Leibniz made, and that is, why does something exist rather than nothing? The universe could have just as easily not existed, and because of that, whoever chose to create the universe had to choose it, and only a person can choose, or a personal being can choose to create. And what are the attributes of God? You may not be able to read it very well here, but it's eternality, self-sufficiency, wisdom, omniscience, omnipotence. All of those things are things that we think of when we think of the attributes of God. Now, let's answer a couple of the common objections to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The first of which we've already answered, which is, well, it may get you to this all-powerful being, but it doesn't get you to God. Okay, let's go to our next objection there. Our next objection is this. It is a God of the gaps. In other words, they're saying, atheists will oftentimes say, well, you just don't have an explanation. Science doesn't have one yet, and therefore you just plop God in wherever you don't understand. I'm sorry, but creation is not a God of the gaps argument, okay? Why? Because it is an inference to the best explanation. Again, we do not see things popping into existence out of nothing. A cell phone indicates a cell phone creator. A building creates a builder. So what we're talking about here is that this is not a God of the gaps. It's going along with what we see in science on an everyday basis. Others say it's a part of the fallacy of composition. And what does that mean? Well, it's kind of complicated, but I'll try to explain that to you. The fallacy of composition would be saying, okay, this feather weighs 5 grams. And if I had 1,000,000 feathers, because the feather weighs 5 grams, 1,000,000 feathers weigh 5 grams. And we all know, of course, that is not true. That's a fallacy of composition. But just because in one way something isn't necessarily the sum of its parts, it can still be in other ways. In other words, what we're saying is, although it's not true that one red brick made into a wall of bricks has the same weight, one red brick does give you one red brick wall. Okay? And that is what we're saying here. That brick is contingent, that wall is contingent, the sum of its parts in this case follows, in that the brick wall is made up of the bricks. That's why it's red, that's why it's solid. In the same manner that matter makes up bigger beings, and ultimately the universe is contingent and has a non-contingent being that created it. Now, you've got objection number 3. This guy here, who just died recently, is one of the most brilliant scientists ever to live. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, amazingly, for like 40 years. And he wrote a book called The Grand Design, Stephen Hawking's. And he said in it, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Let's think about that for just a moment. Gravity is a law of the universe. Before there was a universe, there was no law of gravity. In fact, gravity is the description of attractive forces between two different things in the universe. So, without matter to have gravity acting on it, there is no such thing as gravity. Besides that, he makes a mistake here in that his version of nothing, which includes the law of gravity, is not nothing. Nothing literally means no thing. Nothing. Not energy, not a vacuum, not quantum particles, not gravity, not laws, nothing. No time, space, or matter is nothing. And that's what existed before the universe. Nothing. Okay? Gravity is not nothing. Like I said, upon what would gravity act before matter existed? And if there's nothing to act upon it, if it is just a law, even if the law existed before matter did, if there's no matter to exist upon, how could gravity ever create anything. And that leads me to the conclusion that science doesn't say anything, but scientists do. And sometimes even the world's most brilliant scientists say some of the stupidest things in the world, like Stephen Hawking saying that because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself. That is an anti-scientific statement. Now, that concludes what I have to talk about today. I do want to point out a couple of books to you. I'm going to start with this one, God's Crime Scene. It's written by J. Warner Wallace. It is a follow-on book to his book called Cold Case Detective. Cold Case Christianity, that's it. Cold Case Christianity. In God's Crime Scene, he goes through the same cold case detective type of evidence to look at the beginning of the world. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument. Great read, very fast, very common language written, not written in terms of scholastic type of work. The next one, which is slightly higher up the scale, is called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's written by Norman Geisler, who is a theologian, and Frank Turek, who is actually a PhD lawyer and Christian apologist. And it is an excellent read. It gets into a little bit more detail. It's a bit more complicated, but is also an excellent, excellent read. So I would highly recommend that. The next one is called Reason and Religious Belief. Reason and Religious Belief by Peterson. This is more along the lines of a scholastic textbook or scholars type textbook. If you're really into apologetics, I would recommend it highly. It's very well written, but it is talking about a lot of different philosophical things. And so in terms of the cosmological argument, it has a little less in the way of data. I would also recommend Evidence That Demands a Verdict. This is either the second or third of them, and it's written by Josh and Sean McDowell. It is absolutely excellent. They are both theologians and apologists. Very, very well written. Goes into a lot of the detail behind the evidence for the New and Old Testament. Excellent resource for that. And then, of course, my go-to in terms of true Christian apologetics textbooks is Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith by Douglas Groothuis. And with that, I will conclude my presentation portion.
You were worthy of it all.